Okay. I am really sorry about that. I lost a viewer, but anyway. So yeah, my machine blue screen of death on me, which I can't remember the last time that's happened to me. And it's like I wasn't really doing anything. But I don't know. OBS sucks. So okay, I'm going to... I don't want to stop, because I do want to try to get to the end of part 2. But I will sort of back up a little bit here to this... I'll say... one of the last... Sorry. Let's do... The shaking willows and the heavy buffetings of the wind against our taut little house were the last things I remembered, as sleep came down and covered all with its soft and delicious forgetfulness. Suddenly, I found myself lying awake, peering from my sandy mattress through the door of the tent. I looked at my watch pinned against the canvas, and saw by the bright moonlight that it was past 12 o'clock, the threshold of a new day, and I had therefore slept a couple of hours. The Swede was asleep still beside me. The wind howled as before. Something plucked at my heart and made me feel afraid. There was a sense of disturbance in my immediate neighborhood. I sat up quickly and looked out. The trees were swaying violently to and fro as the gusts smote them, but our little bit of green canvas lay snugly safe in the hollow, for the wind passed over it without meeting enough resistance to make it vicious. The feeling of disquietude did not pass, however, and I crawled quietly out of the tent to see if our belongings were safe. I moved carefully so as not to waken my companion. A curious excitement was on me. I was halfway out, kneeling on all fours, when my eye first took in that the tops of the bushes opposite, with their moving tracery of leaves, made shapes against the sky. I sat back on my haunches and stared. It was incredible, surely, but there, opposite and slightly above me, were shapes of some indeterminate sort among the willows. As the branches swayed in the wind, they seemed to group themselves about these shapes, forming a series of monstrous outlines that shifted rapidly beneath the moon. Close, about 50 feet in front of me, I saw these things. My first instinct was to waken my companion, that he too might see them, but something made me hesitate. The sudden realization, probably, that I should not welcome corroboration, and meanwhile I crouched there staring in amazement with smarting eyes. I was wide awake. I remember saying to myself that I was not dreaming. They first became properly visible, these huge figures, just within the tops of the bushes, immense, bronze-colored, moving, and wholly independent of the swaying of the branches. I saw them plainly and noted, now I came to examine them more calmly, that they were very much larger than human, and indeed that something in their appearance proclaimed them to be not human at all. Certainly they were not merely the moving tracery of the branches against the moonlight. They shifted independently. They rose upward in a continuous stream from earth to sky, vanishing utterly as soon as they reached the dark of the sky. They were interlaced one with another, making a great column, and I saw their limbs and huge bodies melting in and out of each other, forming this serpentine line that bent and swayed and twisted spirally with the contortions of the wind-tossed trees. They were nude, fluid shapes, passing up the bushes, within the leaves almost, rising up in a living column into the heavens. Their faces I could never see. Unceasingly they poured upwards, swaying in great bending curves, with a hue of dull bronze upon their skins. I stared, trying to force every atom of vision from my eyes. For a long time I thought they must every moment disappear and resolve themselves into the movements of the branches, and prove to be an optical illusion. I searched everywhere for a proof of reality, when all the while I understood quite well that the standard of reality had changed. For the longer I looked, the more certain I became that these figures were real and living, although perhaps not according to the standards that the camera and the biologist would insist upon. Far from feeling fear, I was possessed with a sense of awe and wonder such as I have never known. I seemed to be gazing at the personified elemental forces of this haunted and primeval region. Our intrusion had stirred the powers of the place into activity. It was we who were the cause of the disturbance, and my brain filled to bursting with stories and legends of the spirits and deities of place that have been acknowledged and worshipped by men in all ages of the world's history. But before I could arrive at any possible explanation, something impelled me to go farther out, and I crept forward on the sand and stood upright. I felt the ground still warm under my bare feet. The wind tore at my hair and face, and the sound of the river burst upon my ears with a sudden roar. These things, I knew, were real, and proved that my senses were acting normally, yet the figures still rose from earth to heaven, silent, majestically, in a great spiral of grace and strength that overwhelmed me at length with a genuine, deep emotion of worship. I felt that I must fall down and worship, absolutely worship. Perhaps in another minute I might have done so, when a gust of wind swept against me with such force that it blew me sideways, and I nearly stumbled and fell. It seemed to shake the dream violently out of me. At least it gave me another point of view somehow. The figures still remained, still ascended into heaven from the heart of the night, but my reason at last began to assert itself. It must be a subjective experience, I argued. Nonetheless real for that, but still subjective. The moonlight and the branches combined to work out these pictures upon the mirror of my imagination, and for some reason I projected them outwards and made them appear objective. I knew this must be the case, of course. I took courage and began to move forward across the open patches of sand. By Jove, though, was it all hallucination? Was it merely subjective? Did not my reason argue in the old futile way from the little standard of the known? I only know that great column of figures ascended darkly into the sky for what seemed like a very long period of time, and with a very complete measure of reality, as most men are accustomed to gauge reality. Then, suddenly, they were gone. And once they were gone and the immediate wonder of their great presence had passed, fear came down upon me with a cold rush. The esoteric meaning of this lonely and haunted region suddenly flamed up within me, and I began to tremble dreadfully. I took a quick look round, a look of horror that came near to panic, calculating vainly ways of escape, and then realizing how helpless I was to achieve anything really effective. I crept back silently into the tent and lay down again upon my sandy mattress, first lowering the door curtain to shut out the sight of the willows in the moonlight, and then burying my head as deeply as possible beneath the blankets to deaden the sound of the terrifying wind. As though further to convince me that I had not been dreaming, I remember that it was a long time before I fell again into a troubled and restless sleep, and even then, only the upper crust of me slept, and underneath there was something that never quite lost consciousness, but lay alert and on the watch. But the second time I jumped up with a genuine start of terror. It was neither the wind nor the river that woke me, but the slow approach of something that caused the sleeping portion of me to grow smaller and smaller, till at last it vanished altogether, and I found myself sitting bolt upright, listening. Outside, there was a sound of multitudinous little patterings. They had been coming, I was aware, for a long time, and in my sleep they had first become audible. I sat there, nervously wide awake, as though I had not slept at all. It seemed to me that my breathing came with difficulty, and there was a great weight upon the surface of my body. In spite of the hot night, I felt clammy with cold and shivered. Something, surely, was pressing steadily against the sides of the tent and weighing down on it from above. Was it the body of the wind? Was it the pattering rain, the dripping of leaves? The spray blown from the river by the wind and gathering in big drops? I thought quickly of a dozen things. Then suddenly the explanation leapt into my mind. A bough from the poplar, the only large tree on the island, had fallen with the wind. Still half caught by the other branches, it would fall with the next gust and crush us, and meanwhile its leaves brushed and tapped upon the tight canvas surface of the tent. I raised a loose flap and rushed out, calling to the suite to follow. But when I got out and stood upright, I saw that the tent was free. There was no hanging bough. There was no rain or spray. Nothing approached. A cold gray light filtered down through the bushes and lay upon the faintly gleaming sand. Stars still crowded the sky directly overhead, and the wind howled magnificently, but the fire no longer gave out any glow, and I saw the east reddening in streaks through the trees. Several hours must have passed since I stood there before watching the ascending figures, and the memory of it now came back to me horribly, like an evil dream. Oh, how tired it made me feel! That ceaseless raging wind! Yet, though the deep lassitude of a sleepless night was on me, my nerves were tingling with the activity of an equally tireless apprehension, and all idea of repose was out of the question. The river, I saw, had risen further. Its thunder filled the air, and a fine spray made itself felt through my thin, sleeping shirt. Yet, nowhere did I discover the slightest evidence of anything to cause alarm. This deep, prolonged disturbance in my heart remained wholly unaccounted for. My companion had not stirred when I called him, and there was no need to waken him now. I looked about me carefully, noting everything: the turned-over canoe, the yellow paddles, 2 of them, I'm certain, the provision sack and the extra lantern hanging together from the tree, and crowding everywhere about me, enveloping all, the willows, those endless, shaking willows. A bird uttered its morning cry, and a string of duck passed with whirring flight overhead in the twilight. The sand whirled, dry and stinging, about my bare feet in the wind. I walked round the tent and then went out a little way into the bush, so I could see across the river to the farther landscape, and the same profound yet indefinable emotion of distress seized upon me again as I saw the interminable sea of bushes stretching to the horizon, looking ghostly and unreal in the wan light of dawn. I walked softly here and there, still puzzling over that odd sound of infinite pattering, and of that pressure upon the tent that had wakened me. It must have been the wind, I reflected. The wind, bearing on the loose, hot sand, driving the dry particles smartly against the taut canvas, the wind dropping heavily upon our fragile roof. Yet, all the time, my nervousness and malaise increased appreciably. I crossed over to the farther shore and noted how the coastline had altered in the night, and what masses of sand the river had torn away. I dipped my hands and feet into the cool current and bathed my forehead. Already there was a glow of sunrise in the sky and the exquisite freshness of coming day. On my way back, I passed purposely beneath the very bushes where I had seen the column of figures rising into the air, and midway among the clumps, I suddenly found myself overtaken by a sense of vast terror. From the shadows, a large figure went swiftly by. Someone passed me as sure as ever man did. It was a great staggering blow from the wind that helped me forward again, and once out into the more open space, the sense of terror diminished strangely. The winds were about and walking, I remember saying to myself, for the winds often moved like great presences under the trees, and altogether the fear that hovered about me was such an unknown and immense kind of fear, so unlike anything I had ever felt before, that it woke a sense of awe and wonder in me that did much to counteract its worst effects. And when I reached a high point in the middle of the island from which I could see the wide stretch of river, crimson into the sunrise, the whole magical beauty of it all was so overpowering that a sort of wild yearning woke in me and almost brought up a cry in my throat. But this cry found no expression, for as my eyes wandered from the plain beyond to the island round me and noted our little tent half hidden among the willows, a dreadful discovery leaped out at me, compared to which my terror of the walking winds seemed as nothing at all. For a change, I thought, had somehow come about in the arrangement of the landscape. It was not that my point of vantage gave me a different view, but that an alteration had apparently been effected in the relation of the tent to the willows, and of the willows to the tent. Surely the bushes now crowded much closer, unnecessarily, unpleasantly close. They had moved nearer, creeping with silent feet over the shifting sands, drawing imperceptibly nearer by soft, unhurried movements. The willows had come closer during the night. But had the wind moved them? Or had they moved of themselves? I recalled the sound of infinite small patterings and the pressure upon the tent and upon my own heart that caused me to wake in terror. I swayed for a moment in the wind like a tree, finding it hard to keep my upright position on the sandy hillock. There was a suggestion here of personal agency, of deliberate intention, of aggressive hostility, and it terrified me into a sort of rigidity. Then the reaction followed quickly. The idea was so bizarre, so absurd, that I felt inclined to laugh. But the laughter came no more readily than the cry, for the knowledge that my mind was so receptive to such dangerous imaginings brought the additional terror that it was through our minds and not through our physical bodies that the attack would come, and was coming. The wind buffeted me about, and very quickly, it seemed, the sun came up over the horizon, for it was after 4 o'clock, and I must have stood on that little pinnacle of sand longer than I knew, afraid to come down to close quarters with the willows. I returned quietly, creepily, to the tent, first taking another exhaustive look round, and, yes, I confess it, making a few measurements. I paced out on the warm sand the distances between the willows and the tent, making a note of the shortest distance particularly. I crawled stealthily into my blankets. My companion, to all appearances, still slept soundly, and I was glad that this was so. Provided my experiences were not corroborated, I could find strength somehow to deny them, perhaps. With the daylight, I could persuade myself that it was all a subjective hallucination, a fantasy of the night, a projection of the excited imagination. Nothing further came in to disturb me, and I fell asleep almost at once, utterly exhausted, yet still in dread of hearing again that weird sound of multitudinous pattering, or of feeling the pressure upon my heart that had made it difficult to breathe. The sun was high in the heavens when my companion woke me from a heavy sleep and announced that the porridge was cooked and there was just time to bathe. The grateful smell of frizzling bacon entered the tent door. "River's still rising," he said, "and several islands out in midstream have disappeared altogether. Our own island's much smaller." "Any wood left?" I asked sleepily. "The wood in the island will finish tomorrow in a dead heat," he laughed. "But there's enough to last us until then." I plunged in from the point of the island, which had indeed altered a lot in size and shape during the night, and was swept down in a moment to the landing place opposite the tent. The water was icy, and the banks flew by like the country from an express train. Bathing under such conditions was an exhilarating operation, and the terror of the night seemed cleansed out of me by a process of evaporation in the brain. The sun was blazing hot, not a cloud showed itself anywhere. The wind, however, had not abated one little jot. Quite suddenly, then, the implied meaning of the Swede's words flashed across me, showing that he no longer wished to leave post-haste and had changed his mind. Enough to last till tomorrow. He assumed we should stay on the island another night. It struck me as odd. The night before, he was so positive the other way. How had the change come about? Great crumblings of the banks occurred at breakfast, with heavy splashings and clouds of spray which the wind brought into our frying pan, and my fellow traveler talked incessantly about the difficulty the Vienna Pest steamers must have to find the channel in flood. But the state of his mind interested and impressed me far more than the state of the river or the difficulties of the steamers. He had changed somehow since the night before. His manner was different, a trifle excited, a trifle shy, with a sort of suspicion about his voice and gestures. I hardly know how to describe it now in cold blood, but at the time I remember being quite certain of one thing, that he had become frightened. He ate very little breakfast, and for once omitted to smoke his pipe. He had the map spread open beside him, and kept studying its markings. "We'd better get off sharp in an hour," I said presently, feeling for an opening that must bring him indirectly to a partial confession at any rate. And his answer puzzled me uncomfortably. "Rather, if they'll let us." "Who'll let us? The elements?" I asked quickly with affected indifference. "Powers of this awful place, whoever they are," he replied, keeping his eyes on the map. "The gods are here, if they are anywhere at all in the world." "The elements are always the true immortals," I replied, laughing as naturally as I could manage, yet knowing quite well that my face reflected my true feelings when he looked up gravely at me and spoke across the smoke. "We shall be fortunate if we get away without further disaster." This was exactly what I had dreaded, and I screwed myself up to the point of the direct question. It was like agreeing to allow the dentist to extract the tooth. It had to come anyhow in the long run, and the rest was all pretense. "Further disaster? Why, what's happened?" For one thing, the steering paddle's gone, he said quietly. The steering paddle gone? I repeated, greatly excited, for this was our rudder, and the Danube in flood without a rudder was suicide. But what? And there's a tear on the bottom of the canoe, he added, with a genuine little tremor in his voice. I continued staring at him, able only to repeat the words in his face somewhat foolishly. There, in the heat of the sun, and on this burning sand, I was aware of a freezing atmosphere descending round us. I got up to follow him, for he nearly nodded his head gravely and led the way towards the tent a few yards on the other side of the fireplace. The canoe still lay there as I had seen her in the night, ribs uppermost, the paddles, or rather the paddle, on the sand beside her. There's only one, he said, stopping to pick it up. And here's the rent in the baseboard. It was on the tip of my tongue to tell him that I had clearly noticed 2 paddles a few hours before, but a second impulse made me think better of it, and I said nothing. I approached to see. There was a long, finely made tear in the bottom of the canoe where a little slither of wood had been neatly taken clean out. It looked as if the tooth of a sharp rock or snag had eaten down her length. An investigation showed that the hole went through. Had we launched her without observing it, we must inevitably have foundered. At first the water would have made the wood swell as so to close the hole, but once out in midstream the water must have poured in, and the canoe, never more than 2 inches above the surface, would have filled and sunk very rapidly. There, you see an attempt to prepare a victim for the sacrifice, I heard him saying. 2 victims, rather, he added as he bent over and ran his fingers along the slit. I began to whistle, a thing I always do unconsciously when utterly nonplussed, and purposely paid no attention to his words. I was determined to consider them foolish. It wasn't there last night, he said presently, straightening up from his examination and looking anywhere but at me. We must have scratched her in landing, of course, I stopped whistling to say. The stones are very sharp. I stopped abruptly, for at that moment he turned round and met my eyes squarely. I knew, just as well as he did, how impossible my explanation was. There were no stones, to begin with. And there's this, too, he added quietly, handing me the paddle and pointing to the blade. A new and curious emotion spread freezingly over me as I took and examined it. The blade was scraped down all over, beautifully scraped, as though someone had sandpapered it with care, making it so thin that the first vigorous stroke must have snapped it off at the elbow. One of us walked in his sleep and did this thing, I said feebly, or it has been filed by the constant stream of sand particles blown against it by the wind, perhaps. Ha ha! Said the Swede, turning away, laughing a little. You can explain everything. The same wind that caught the steering paddle and flung it so near the bank that it fell in with the next lump that crumbled, I called out after him, absolutely determined to find an explanation for everything he showed me. I see, he shouted back, turning his head to look at me before disappearing among the willow bushes. Once alone with these perplexing evidences of personal agency, I think my first thoughts took the form one of us must have done this thing, and it was certainly not I. But my second thought decided how impossible it was to suppose, under all the circumstances, that either of us had done it. That my companion, the trusted friend of a dozen similar expeditions, could have knowingly had a hand in it, was a suggestion not to be entertained for a moment. Equally absurd seemed the explanation that this imperturbable and densely practical nature had suddenly become insane and was busied with insane purposes. Yet the fact remained that what disturbed me most, and kept my fear actively alive even in this blaze of sunshine and wild beauty, was the clear certainty that some curious alteration had come about in his mind, that he was nervous, timid, suspicious, aware of goings-on that he did not speak about, watching a series of secret and hitherto unmentionable events, waiting, in a word, for a climax that he expected, and, I thought, expected very soon. This grew up in my mind intuitively. I hardly know how. I made a hurried examination of the tent and its surroundings, but the measurements of the night remained the same. There were deep hollows formed in the sand, I now noticed for the first time, basin-shaped and of various depths and sizes, varying from that of a teacup to a large bowl. The wind, no doubt, was responsible for these miniature craters, just as it was for lifting the paddle and tossing it towards the water. The rent in the canoe was the only thing that seemed quite inexplicable, and after all, it was conceivable that a sharp point had caught it when we landed. The examination I made of the shore did not assist this theory, but all the same, I clung to it with that diminishing portion of my intelligence which I called my reason. An explanation of some kind was an absolute necessity, just as some working explanation of the universe is necessary, however absurd, to the happiness of every individual who seeks to do his duty in the world and face the problems of life. The simile seemed to me at the time an exact parallel. I at once set the pitch melting, and presently the Swede joined me at the work, though, under the best conditions in the world, the canoe could not be safe for traveling until the following day. I drew his attention casually to the hollows in the sand. "Yes," he said, "I know. They're all over the island. But you can explain them, no doubt." "Wind, of course," I answered without hesitation. "Have you never watched those little whirlwinds in the street that twist and twirl everything into a circle? The sand's loose enough to yield, that's all." He made no reply, and we worked on in silence for a bit. I watched him surreptitiously all the time, and I had an idea he was watching me. He seemed, too, to be always listening attentively to something I could not hear, or perhaps for something that he expected to hear, for he kept turning about and staring into the bushes and up into the sky, and out across the water where it was visible through the openings among the willows. Sometimes he even put his hand to his ear and held it there for several minutes. He said nothing to me, and... there's another content warning coming up. He said nothing to me, however, about it, and I asked no questions. And meanwhile, as he mended that torn canoe with the skill and address of a Red Indian, I was glad to notice his absorption in the work, for there was a vague dread in my heart that he would speak of the changed aspect of the Willows. And if he had noticed that, my imagination could no longer be held a sufficient explanation of it. And that ends part 2. I'm sorry about the interruption. I kind of wonder how that's going to look when I review the recording later. Yeah, it kind of broke the mood slightly. It kind of came at a sort of curious time at the story, too. So, I am definitely liking this one a lot. I'm bearing in mind some of the things that Chad Pfeiffer and Chris Lackey had to say about it. I kind of want to review that podcast of theirs. I remember them thinking. I remember one of them anyway saying that they thought that the story just took forever to kind of get started, and I liked it though. How Blackwood goes on an extended description of the Danube, all down its length, because apparently that's what he and his friend the Swede, or the narrator and the Swede had done in the story. Is they started at it's basically like the grand tour of sorts, starting at the origins of the Danube and trying to travel all the way down its length. Pretty impressive. And he goes to these great lengths to establish the Danube as feeling alive and like a friend, or at least someone to be respected. And I think that is very important and is worth taking time over, because it ends up becoming a contrast to what happens next, where it seems that this great force that's followed them for days and days and days has suddenly disappeared on them. The Willows have swallowed it up. There's the Blackwood describes looking down river, and it's just like you could see the river for maybe another mile, and then it just disappears into this sea of willows. So I think Blackwood's done very well here to spend so much time establishing how great a forest the Danube is, and then this other forest can just swallow it up in 1 mile. It's I think that's well done, and there's something about this whole passage, by the way, or the whole story, really, although mostly this kind of first half of it, that I suspect that J.R.R. Tolkien read this story, and that there's elements of this coming through in the chapter of The Lord of the Rings called The Old Forest, where willows, although not little tiny willows like these, but great big willow trees, are important. They're the old man willow is kind of the evil, rotten king of the forest that hates humans, and or not humans, but hates invaders. And when the hobbits enter the old forest, they're taken with the sense that the willows are alive and move without wind, and can crowd in on them in the night. Like this is all stuff from here. But the thing that's kind of, Tolkien's going for one kind of sort of enemy in there, like an actual personified enemy. The trees as individuals, which of course ends up figuring into the depiction of the Ents. Blackwood, though, is going for something quite a bit different here. The willows are not trees. He goes to some point to establish that. They don't rise to the dignity of trees. They're just these kind of little scrubby things that have very little individual character. Like there's one poplar on this little island, like the one tree that's not a willow, and it's just like the mere fact that it's not a willow is remarkable. That these willows are more like this insensible force, not a personification, like not old man willow, but just this sort of this kind of invading army. And so that's a remarkable thing about this. The vision in the one of the bits that I definitely remember the Lovecraft podcast guys not liking was the vision of the bronze figures, where the one that I was just getting to when my computer crashed, which I thought, hey, that's synchronicity for you. Anyway, yeah, like they thought that it was sort of like, they thought that it was going for sort of like taking taking away any notion that, like, I'm not saying this well. Like, basically, they want a slower build-up in a weird fiction story. Like, they like this sort of slow accumulation of little things going wrong or seeming wrong or whatever. And there's a lot of that in the story. But then all of a sudden, there's this, like, utterly otherworldly experience. Something that is not... Like, yes, he's trying really hard to say, oh, I was just seeing something. Like, it was just... patterns formed by the branches or something like that. But this is still, it's a pretty remarkable departure, what he's describing from the ordinary. I'm gonna roll with it, though. Like, I think, I'm not gonna say that it's out of place, like they were kind of suggesting. Like it was too dramatic an eruption of the supernatural into the story at a time when they're trying to sort of build up things more subtly. It's like, yeah, okay, but like it is at night, at midnight, at that, it's within the realm of the possible that, okay, like, maybe the guy wasn't actually, awake. That happens. You have dreams or you think you're awake. Or, basically you could come up with just enough of a sort of rational explanation, as he tries to do in the story, that, like, I'll accept that, okay, like, maybe this is something that isn't necessarily, like, explicitly and obviously supernatural. Also, I like the mythic overtones too much. He talks about spirits of place, and earlier on he made a similar allusion to Romans with their worship, their groves and their temples and stuff like that. So that's another little suggestion, like, hey, maybe he's seeing something that sort of kind of goes back to Roman times. It's we don't know what's going on. And the idea that they are spirits of place is that certainly kind of fits in with my sort of spirituality anyway. And there's he's moved to just, he plainly has, like, a spiritual, like, this is a mystical experience. He feels moved, like, he's in awe. Like, he's been describing all of this fear that he's been having, this feel of being unwanted, and that we got to get out of here. Like, we're invaders, and yet right in the middle of. But this particular experience is not like that. He's not fearful. He wants to fall down on his knees, but then he's kind of interrupted. The wind and the weather interrupt him, and all of a sudden it's just like, he's back to, well, am I really seeing this or am I not? Like, the spell's broken. God, there was a particular thought that came to mind with that passage that now it's kind of escaping me. Shit. Like, it happened while I was reading, and that's escaped me, I think. And it's just... Oh, right, that's what it was. that moment where he takes as proof that he is seeing something real and believable, because he still feels the ground under his feet. The wind is still tearing at him. He still hears the river. All of these are just normal things that he is perceiving, as well as perceiving that. He takes it as proof. This is something real that I am seeing right now. And I find that there is an analogy there to kind of my first really serious spiritual experience. That it had somewhat of the character of like what one would say, like hallucination. You know, there were sort of alterations of what I could see with my eyes. But the really remarkable thing about the experience that just kind of distinguished it from anything that I'd ever, sort of anything like it that I'd ever had before, including like stuff that was like under the effect of drugs, is that I could snap out of it and then back into it. Like, I could sort of close my eyes and sort of sink back into this completely different perception of the world. And yet, I was still a bit aware that I was, that there was, that there was the real world out there, and I could kind of bring myself back to it and then sink back in. And the fact that that the experience was like this is one of the things that made me kind of think, yeah, like there's something serious going on here. This isn't just, oh, my brain farted, and this experience that seemed to blend in seamlessly with my perception of my room and everything. It compelled belief, and I did end up choosing to believe it. I think that's sort of what faith to me isn't like faith in an entity. It's faith in your own perceptions. That's the most important that's what faith is to me. That you trust your own perceptions and your own interpretation of them, your own knowledge. If what you happen to perceive seems to indicate the existence of something metaphysical or supernatural, then, you accept it. You roll with it. That's kind of what got me back into considering myself to be religious. But anyway, back to like one sort of last little bit of commentary on the story so far. The Swede, we're kind of told how rational and unimaginative he is, but that's not really established. We just kind of have to accept it. Like, it would be difficult, I suppose, to try to give the Swede, like, I don't know, some kind of dialogue or something early in the story to indicate his change of mind and attitude that occurs. That's being described here. How he's becoming imaginative. He's starting to listen for things that other people can't hear and things like that. And that's very unsettling. But here, I don't know. It's just sort of, okay, yeah, I guess we'll just have to accept that this is weird. Because really, the Swede perhaps isn't being any more fanciful than the narrator has already been. The narrator has definitely drawn some pretty impressive conclusions based on his perceptions about what might be going on. The real difference seems to be that whereas the narrator was moved to awe by his whatever it was that kind of impressed him, whatever it was that's affecting the Swede is doing the other thing. He's not filled with awe. He's filled with fear, and we'll find out as the story goes on just how deep in the grip of that fear the Swede actually is. He's already sounding really unsettled, and the business of these kind of all these little things being done to their camp. The paddle being one paddle stolen, the other sanded down in this weird way. A thin hole made in the canoe. It's this is all like really kind of good horror story stuff. This is kind of Blair Witch, things. I think a similar thing being hinted at. I think with the pits and the sand that it's definitely being hinted that there's something a bit unnatural about these, and so that experience of being in the woods or whatever, and just kind of having these strange little alterations to the environment around you, like little figures of stones and sticks, or just appearing, we're kind of in that territory. Although it's sort of, it's kind of. I'll tell you what my sort of kind of odd feeling in here is that there's a couple of different forces at work here. The narrator saw one of these things. His spirits rising up into the sky, but that's not everyone that's present here. Is my guess. Anyway, I think that about wraps it up. I've been talking again for another hour. It's almost 2. Anyway, I will next Saturday, I hope, be finishing the story, parts 3 and 4 of Algernon Blackwood's The Willows. I hope that you who listened have enjoyed my somewhat interrupted and occasionally messy reading. My voice has been kind of kicking in and out on me, and I fluff lines and stuff like that. I'm hoping to get better at this. Anyway, this is Kara Dreamer, signing off for the night.